crisp October air was filled with the soft rustling of leaves as a group of trick-or-treaters wandered from house to house. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered faintly on porches, casting a warm orange glow on the children's faces as they collected their candy. Laughter filled the night, but the group of 5 friends, Lily, Max, Sophie, Jonah, and Emma, were more focused on finding one particular house. Rumor had it that on the edge of the neighborhood, an old mansion was handing out treats like no other. Candy so rare and delicious, it was said to be magical. The mansion was known for only appearing on Halloween night, a local legend passed down from one group of trick-or-treaters to the next. No one knew exactly where it stood, but whispers spread quickly among the kids. If you could find it, you'd be in for the best Halloween of your life. "Are you sure it's real?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide behind her vampire mask. Max, who was dressed as a pirate, shrugged. "That's what my older brother said. He went last year and said it was the best candy ever. Chocolate that melts in your mouth, and lollipops that change flavors with every lick." Lily, the unofficial leader of the group, adjusted her witch hat. "We'll never know if we don't find it. Come on, it's supposed to be around this street." The 5 kids walked further from the familiar rows of houses, where the porch lights grew dimmer and the streets quieter. Eventually, they reached the end of a cul-de-sac. A cold breeze picked up, making the leaves swirl around their feet. And then, as if it had been waiting for them, they saw it. A mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the cloudy sky. It was massive, much bigger than any house they'd passed so far. Towering spires reached up toward the stars, and its windows were dark, save for one faint light flickering inside. A wrought iron gate, slightly ajar, led up to the front porch where a single lantern swayed gently. "I wasn't here before," Jonah muttered, pulling his hood up to block the sudden chill. Emma, the quietest of the group, nodded slowly. "I don't remember seeing it last year either." Lily, never one to back down, took the first step forward. "Come on, if this is the house, we have to check it out. You heard what Max said about the candy." With hesitant steps, the others followed. The gate creaked as they pushed it open, and the gravel pathway crunched beneath their feet. The mansion seemed to watch them as they approached, its dark windows like eyes hidden in shadow. "Maybe we should go back," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "No way," Max said, trying to sound brave even though his heart raced. "We're already here." The front door, large and ornate, suddenly swung open with a loud groan. Inside, they could see flickering candles lining a long hallway. No one stood at the door to greet them, no signs of life beyond the faint glow of candlelight. "That's creepy," Sophie whispered. "Let's just grab some candy and go," Jonah added, glancing over his shoulder nervously. Lily stepped over the threshold and the others followed, though their excitement had dimmed slightly, replaced by a growing unease. The mansion felt cold, far colder than the outside. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly sweet, like candy left out for too long. In the entryway, a large bowl of candy sat on a table, wrapped in shiny foil and bright colors. It looked inviting, almost too perfect, like a trick disguised as a treat. "Looks like we found it," Max said, reaching for the bowl. But as his fingers touched the wrapper, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. All 5 of them jumped, spinning around to see the door firmly closed, no one in sight. The mansion now felt even more imposing, the walls seeming to close in on them as shadows danced along the floor. "This isn't funny," Emma whispered, clutching her candy bag tightly. "Relax," Lily said, though her voice wavered. "We're just getting started. It's Probably part of the experience. But as they stood there, staring at the darkened hallway ahead, none of them could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something about the mansion was far too real and far too chilling. The slam of the door echoed through the vast hallway, the sound lingering in the silence that followed. The trick-or-treaters exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to be the first to suggest leaving. Not yet. The promise of legendary treats still dangled before them, even if the mansion was beginning to feel more like a trap than a Halloween adventure. "Let's grab the candy and go," Max said, his voice quieter now. He stepped forward again, reaching for the brightly wrapped treats in the bowl. This time no one stopped him. The others watched as he unwrapped a piece of chocolate and popped it into his mouth. For a moment his face was blank, and then his eyes widened. "Whoa," he said, his voice muffled by the chocolate. "It's like nothing I've ever tasted." Curiosity got the better of them. Lily, Sophie, Jonah, and Emma each took a piece of candy from the bowl, unwrapping it slowly. The wrappers crinkled in the stillness of the room, and soon they were all savoring the taste. The candy was indeed incredible. Rich flavors melted on their tongues, shifting from sweet to tart, spicy to cool. It was like magic. Each piece was different, never the same twice. For a brief moment, the unease they'd felt seemed to fade, replaced by the strange, almost hypnotic pleasure of the treats. But the calm didn't last long. "Okay, now we leave," Jonah said, brushing crumbs from his hands. His eyes darted to the closed door. "This place is giving me the creeps." Lily nodded, though she didn't move right away. Something about the house still intrigued her, despite the unsettling atmosphere. The candy had felt like an invitation, a lure maybe, but an irresistible one. As if on cue, the hallway ahead of them lit up. More candles flickered to life, revealing a grand staircase leading up to the second floor. The shadows shifted, moving like they were alive, dancing along the walls. A faint sound, almost like music, drifted down from somewhere above. "Is someone else here?" Emma whispered, clutching her bag of candy tightly. "Maybe it's the owners," Max suggested, but his voice wasn't as confident as before. He glanced at the others. "Should we check it out?" Sophie shook her head quickly. "I think we've seen enough. Let's just leave." But the door behind them remained stubbornly shut, no matter how hard Jonah pushed on it. "We're not trapped, right?" Jonah's voice wavered slightly. "This is just some weird Halloween prank, right?" Lily took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Let's just explore a little," she said. "Maybe there's another way out. Besides, it's probably all part of the fun." No one seemed convinced, but they followed her anyway. The strange music grew louder as they climbed the stairs, and the house seemed to hum with energy. The higher they went, the colder it became. The walls were lined with portraits of people in old-fashioned clothes, their eyes seeming to follow the kids as they passed. The top of the stairs led to a long hallway lined with closed doors. Faint light glowed from beneath each one, but none of the kids made a move to open them. The sense of being watched was stronger here, the shadows deeper and more sinister. "Let's just find an exit," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. At the end of the hallway was a large, ornate door, different from the others. It was cracked open, and from within, the music flowed more clearly, a haunting melody that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. Without thinking, Lily stepped toward it, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Lily, don't—" Max started, but it was too late. She pushed the door open the rest of the way, revealing a large, dimly lit room. Inside was a grand table, set with silver platters and crystal glasses, all covered in dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like delicate curtains. The room smelled faintly of something old, something forgotten. And at the far end, sitting in a high-backed chair, was a figure. Lily gasped, stepping back into the hallway as the others crowded behind her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the shadows around it seemed to stretch out, reaching toward them, as if inviting them in. "We need to get out of here," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. But as the shadows crept closer, it became clear that leaving wasn't going to be as easy as they'd hoped. The house had invited them in, and now it wasn't ready to let them go. The figure in the high-backed chair remained still, its face hidden by the shadows, as though it were part of the room itself. The group of trick-or-treaters stood frozen at the door, the eerie melody from the room seeping into their bones. No one dared to step inside, but the air felt thick, like it was pulling them forward. Lily was the first to break the silence. "We need to go. Now." But before anyone could move, the candles around the grand table flickered to life, casting an unnatural glow over the room. The dust and cobwebs that had covered the table seemed to melt away, revealing gleaming silver platters and towering trays of food. Cakes drizzled with glistening caramel, candy apples shimmering with a crimson sheen, and rows of the finest chocolates lined the table, more extravagant than anything they had ever seen. The shadows seemed to retreat slightly, the figure still motionless at the far end, but its presence was a constant heavy weight in the room. Max, ever the brave one, took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the mountain of treats. "Look at that," he whispered, mesmerized. "It's all for us, just like they said. The best Halloween treats ever." Lily grabbed his arm. "Max, no! Something's wrong. This isn't right." But Max was already walking toward the table as if he couldn't hear her. The others watched in silent horror, unsure whether to follow or run. The delicious smells wafting from the feast were almost overpowering, intoxicating in a way that made their heads spin. As Max reached the table, his hand hovered over a tray of colorful candies. But before he could touch them, the figure at the end of the table finally stirred. Its head turned ever so slightly, just enough for them to see its pale, bony hand resting on the arm of the chair. Max froze, his hand trembling above the platter. I'm sorry," he stammered, stepping back. "I didn't mean—" But before he could finish, the figure spoke. Its voice was a low, hollow whisper, like wind passing through the cracks of a forgotten tomb. "The feast is yours, little ones. Take what you desire." The trick-or-treaters huddled together near the doorway, the shadows now seeming to dance with a life of their own. Jonah glanced at the others, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this. We need to leave." Sophie tugged at Lily's sleeve. "She's right. This isn't real. None of this should be happening." But the smell of the food, the allure of the gleaming treats, held them in place. They could feel the pull, as if the house itself was trying to keep them there, to make them stay. Max backed away from the table, his face pale. "I don't want any of it," he muttered, finally realizing the danger. "We should go." The figure at the end of the table chuckled, a sound that made their skin crawl. "You've already come this far," it whispered. "Surely you don't wish to leave hungry." Emma, who had been the quietest among them, took a step back toward the door, her eyes wide with fear. "Let's leave. Please." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut again with a loud bang, just as it had downstairs. They were trapped. The shadows along the walls thickened, inching closer, and the figure stood, its tall, thin frame looming over the table. "You are guests in my house," it whispered, its voice curling through the air like smoke. And guests must stay until the feast is over. The table groaned as the platters and trays shifted, the food appearing to grow more abundant by the second. The trick-or-treaters backed up until they were pressed against the door, panic setting in. The house had lured them in with promises of legendary treats, but now it was clear they weren't meant to leave. The shadows reached out, brushing against their feet, cold as ice. The figure, still half hidden in darkness, took a step closer, and the candlelight dimmed. Lily clenched her fists, trying to stay calm. We have to find another way out. But how? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. The door's locked. We'll figure it out, Lily said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. We have to. As the figure moved ever closer, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, the group knew one thing for certain. They weren't just trick-or-treaters anymore. They were prisoners in a house that was far more than it appeared, but if they didn't escape soon, they might never leave. The feast, it seemed, had only just begun. The moment the door behind them slammed shut, the trick-or-treaters knew they were in serious trouble. The room, once dimly lit by the flickering candles, seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing thicker, darker. The figure at the head of the table had receded back into the gloom, but the memory of its hollow voice still echoed in their minds. We need to get out of here, Jonah said, his voice shaky. Now. Lily grabbed the door handle and twisted it furiously. It wouldn't budge. Panic crept into her chest as she banged on the door with her fist. It's locked! Max tugged at the edges of his pirate costume, his face pale. It's like the house doesn't want us to leave. Emma stepped forward, trying to push the door with all her strength, but it held firm. She looked back toward the darkened room, her eyes wide. Maybe there's another way out. Without a word, Lily led the group back down the long hallway they had come from, hoping to find another exit. The mansion was eerily quiet now, the soft music that had lured them inside gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch their every move, their eyes following them with silent judgment. Sophie shuddered as they passed by one particularly grim painting of a gaunt man holding a lantern. I feel like we're being watched, she whispered. You're not the only one, Max muttered, glancing over his shoulder. At the top of the grand staircase, the group paused, looking down at the foyer. The door they had entered through was still shut tight, but something was different. The lantern that had swayed gently on the porch earlier was gone, and outside the windows, nothing but an endless fog pressed against the glass. The houses, the streets, everything familiar, they had vanished. We're not in the neighborhood anymore, Jonah said, his voice barely audible. Then where are we? Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Lily shook her head. I don't know, but we need to get out before we figure that out. They hurried down the stairs, the air growing colder as they descended. When they reached the bottom, Lily tried the front door again, yanking on it with all her strength. It didn't budge. She slammed her fists against it in frustration, but it was as if the house had locked them in, holding them tight within its walls. We have to find another way, Lily said, determination edging her voice. They darted toward a side hallway they hadn't noticed before, hoping it would lead them somewhere, anywhere, outside. But as they turned the corner, they were met with something that made them freeze. The hallway was gone. In its place was a mirror stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting their pale faces back at them. The reflection was unnerving, almost too clear, as if it were watching them just as intently as the portraits had. Worse, behind them in the reflection, they could see the shadows creeping closer, swallowing the candlelight as they moved. We need to move, Lily said quickly, her voice sharp with fear. They ran back to the foyer, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. But no matter where they turned, the house seemed to shift around them. Hallways twisted into dead ends, and doors they hadn't seen before opened into rooms they couldn't recognize. "It's like the house is moving," Sophie said breathlessly. "It's changing every time we turn around." Max's face grew pale as he glanced toward one of the windows. "Guys, look." Through the fog pressing against the glass, they could barely make out the outline of the mansion. But it wasn't where it had been before. The house had shifted. The street outside, though swallowed in mist, was no longer the street they had first walked down. "It's moving," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with dread. "The whole house is moving." Lily's heart pounded in her chest. The mansion wasn't just a trap. It was a living, breathing thing, shifting and changing, keeping them from finding their way out. She glanced at her friends, all of them looking as frightened as she felt. "We have to stay together," she said firmly, "and we have to keep looking. There has to be a way out." But deep down, they all knew the truth. The house wasn't letting them go, not without a fight. And as they stood there, lost in the eerie silence, they could feel it watching them, waiting for their next move. The house had them now, and it wasn't about to let them go easily. The group stood frozen in the foyer, their breaths shallow and cold in the thickening air. The mansion groaned softly as if settling into the earth, but Lily knew better. It wasn't settling. It was shifting, moving under their feet like a creature that had just woken from a long slumber. The fog outside pressed tighter against the windows, swallowing any trace of the world they once knew. "We can't just stay here," Jonah said, his voice shaky. "It's playing with us." Lily nodded, her mind racing. The house had shifted. It had changed the landscape, erased the streets, and replaced them with the dense, swirling fog. If they didn't move quickly, the house might take them somewhere even darker, somewhere they might never escape. "Let's try upstairs again," she suggested. "Maybe we missed something." Max looked uneasy. "Upstairs? You think that's safer?" "Do you have a better idea?" Lily snapped, her nerves fraying. "We've tried everything down here." Max didn't respond, but he fell into step behind the others as they made their way back up the grand staircase. The air felt thicker now, almost suffocating, and with each step, the mansion seemed to creak and sigh, like it was pleased with their decision to stay. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was just as they had left it, or so it seemed. The same portraits lined the walls, but their eyes, once merely unsettling, now seemed alive, tracking every move the kids made. The air was colder here, colder than it had any right to be, and the faint sound of that haunting music drifted back into their ears. Lily stopped short at the first door they'd passed earlier. She turned the knob slowly, half expecting it to be locked, but the door swung open easily. Inside was a bedroom, bathed in moonlight from the tall, narrow window. But something was wrong. The room seemed too perfect, too untouched by time. The four-poster bed, perfectly made, sat in the center, and a small vanity was placed neatly against the wall. Dust covered nothing, and in the corner, a rocking chair swayed gently, though there was no one to push it. "Something's wrong here," Emma whispered. "It's like it's waiting for us." Lily stepped into the room, her heart pounding. The others followed cautiously, their eyes darting around, half expecting the shadows to jump at them. Max walked toward the window, hoping for some clue about where they were now. But when he reached it, his breath caught in his throat. "It's not just fog out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily joined him at the window, her stomach dropping as she looked out. The mansion, once situated in the familiar neighborhood, now appeared to hover above a landscape she didn't recognize. Below, there was nothing but swirling darkness, an endless abyss of mist and shadow. The house wasn't just moving, it was floating, drifting through some twisted in-between world where time and place had no meaning. "We're not even in the real world anymore," Jonah muttered, backing away from the window. "This place, it's not just a house, it's alive." As if to confirm his words, the floor beneath them shuddered slightly, like the house was shifting its position again. The soft, haunting music returned, louder now, more insistent. It came from somewhere deep in the house, as if calling to them. "We need to leave this room," Lily said quickly, pulling the others back into the hallway. "There has to be an exit. Maybe the music is a clue." "You want to follow it?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Do you have a better idea?" Lily shot back, her frustration mounting. Every second spent in the house felt like it brought them closer to being lost forever. The hallway stretched out before them, darker than before, the shadows flickering and twisting like they had lives of their own. The music grew louder as they moved, a strange, hypnotic melody that made their skin crawl, but also pulled them forward. They reached another door at the end of the hall, and Lily hesitated before pushing it open. The room beyond was smaller than the others, a study with walls lined with dusty books and a large fireplace that hadn't been lit in decades. The grand piano sat in the corner, untouched, but what caught their attention was the large mirror above the fireplace. The same mirror they'd seen downstairs, but here it was again, reflecting not just their faces, but the figure they had seen earlier, the one sitting at the head of the table. It stood behind them in the reflection, closer than it should have been. "We have to get out of here," Max whispered, his voice filled with fear. But the house wasn't done with them yet. The shadows along the walls stretched, growing longer, reaching out toward the group like dark tendrils, slowly pulling them deeper into the mansion's grasp. The house was moving, and so were they, whether they wanted to or not. The shadows closed in, creeping along the floor and up the walls like dark, silent predators. The trick-or-treaters stood frozen, watching in horror as the mirror's reflection twisted the room, the figure behind them looming closer with every second. The mansion felt alive, its walls pulsing, and the air was thick with the chill of something ancient, something hungry. Lily took a step back, her breath quickening. "We can't stay here. It's trying to trap us." Sophie clutched her candy bag tighter, as if it could protect her from the creeping darkness. "But how do we get out? Every time we move, the house changes." Max nodded, swallowing hard. "It's like it wants us lost in here forever." Lily's mind raced. She looked at the others, seeing the same fear reflected in their eyes. They had been lured into the house with promises of legendary treats, but it was clear now. The house had no intention of letting them go. And if they didn't act fast, they might never leave. "The music," Jonah said suddenly, his voice urgent. "The music we've been hearing. What if it's leading us somewhere?" Emma frowned, her voice trembling. "Leading us where? Deeper into the house? Into a trap? Or maybe out," Jonah countered. "Maybe it's the only way to escape." Lily considered it. The house was constantly shifting, trapping them in its maze of hallways and rooms, but the music had been a constant presence, guiding them ever since they entered. It was a risk, but staying put was no longer an option. "We follow the music," Lily said, making the decision. "It's the only thing that hasn't changed." The others hesitated, but with no other plan, they nodded in agreement. A soft, haunting melody echoed through the mansion, distant but persistent. The group hurried out of the room and back into the hallway, the shadows still curling at their feet, but no longer reaching out. The music was louder now, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It wasn't a normal sound, more like a ghostly lullaby, eerie yet oddly comforting in the suffocating silence. As they moved, the mansion groaned, its walls shifting once again. But this time the group didn't stop. They kept following the music, moving quickly down the twisting halls, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The house was trying to confuse them, turning corners into dead ends and opening doors that led nowhere. But the music guided them through the labyrinth. Every time the path changed, the melody seemed to grow stronger, pulling them forward, urging them to keep going. At last, they reached a door that hadn't been there before, a tall, ornate wooden door that seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of the music. The air around it was colder, but the feeling was different, like something was waiting for them on the other side. "This has to be it," Lily whispered, her hand hovering over the door's handle. "It has to be the way out." Sophie looked skeptical. "Or it could be a trap." Lily met her gaze, fear and determination swirling in her chest. There's only one way to find out. With a deep breath, Lily turned the handle and pushed the door open. A gust of icy air rushed past them, and for a moment the room beyond was nothing but darkness. But then, the music swelled, and the shadows receded, revealing what lay ahead. It was the foyer. The same foyer they had entered hours before, though it felt like days. The front door, which had been firmly locked before, stood open now, a sliver of moonlight spilling through from the outside world. The fog was still thick outside, but the streetlights flickered in the distance, barely visible through the mist. "We made it," Jonah breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. The group didn't waste any time. They sprinted across the foyer, their shoes slipping on the polished floor as the house groaned and shifted behind them. The shadows were still close, lingering at the edges of the room, but they didn't reach for them this time. The music faded as they crossed the threshold, leaving only silence in its wake. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, but it felt real, comforting even. They stood on the front steps of the mansion, breathing hard, their hearts pounding in their chests. The house loomed behind them, silent once again, its windows dark and empty. But when they turned to look, the mansion was already starting to disappear. Slowly, the towering spires and Gothic windows faded into the mist, as if the house had never been there at all. Max stared in disbelief. "It's gone." Lily nodded, her hands trembling. "It was never really here to begin with." As they walked down the now familiar street, the neighborhood slowly reappeared around them. Porch lights flickered back to life, and the soft sounds of distant laughter echoed through the night. But the memory of the moving house lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of the place that almost took them. And as they disappeared into the fog, none of them dared to look back.